Alright, so where we left off in class, we were going over in the outline the differences between red and yellow marrow. Okay, so pick it up from there. I've already downloaded the whole outline onto the Canvas site for you so you can follow along. The next big thing is what's going to be called ossification. Ossification deals with the hardening of a bone, meaning that it's going to draw minerals from the blood and then going to create the matrix around the lacuna. So the osteoblast will absorb the calcium salts and then place it into the surrounding area to make the bone actual hard. This has to be done with hydroxyapatite, which is calcium phosphate, and calcium carbonate. What's going to hold it together is going to be collagen. All of those need to be present. Alright, so if you look on your notes, there's two main methods of ossification. One is called intramembranous, the other one is called endochondral. Don't have time to go through the whole long list like we would in class. However, I'm giving you the finer points, okay? For intramembranous, big, huge star, note bedazzle. Number one, it's going to be how short bones, how irregular bones, and how flat bones are going to be hardened. This goes from when I went over in class. It's going to form something called diploe. If you remember, that's where we had a layer of spongy bone with a layer of compact bone above and a compact bone below. So it sort of acted almost like a cushion. So all those three types of bones form via intramembranous ossification. How it goes with, you can read the notes just as well as I can, but real fast. What you're going to have is a template laid out of the bone. It's what's called mesenchyme. Mesenchyme is a fancy word in embryological science to basically say undifferentiated tissue at that time. Okay, so what now happens is we're going to have chondrocytes come in, followed by osteoblasts that are come in. What they will then now begin to do is they will start to ossify the tissue. When they do that, when they ossify the tissue, it's basically going to become spongy bone. However, on the upper and lower levels, they're going to keep depositing more and more minerals so that therefore with the spongy bone, the holes that were there get filled in almost like a ceramic glaze, and so therefore you get a layer of compact above, compact below, and sponge in the middle. Think about like how the skull is. It's hard on the outside, hard on the inside, and has that more of a spongy layer in the middle. Again, it gives you the same strength, but a fraction of the amount of mass that would have to go with that. Now, with that then, if you go on the next one, it's called endochondral ossification. Remember from class that chondro is the Latin root word for cartilage. So this now means that we're going to have a foundation or a template laid of cartilage first. And then it's going to be filled in with bone progressively as it forms. So please note, star bedazzle, for the endochondral ossification, that's going to be long bones, period. Think of bones of like your arms, your legs, they're longer than they are wide. Okay, so if you would picture a femur, and then what you would have it all laid down in hyaline cartilage. This would be you as an embryo inside mommy. Roughly about 6, 7, 8 weeks after you've been inside mommy, it's going to start to ossify. Well, how's it ossify? We said in class, does it ossify from the middle toward the tips or from the tips toward the middle? The middle toward the tips, because otherwise the bone could not grow any longer. So what will happen is if you read through it in short, just so we can cut out time here, we're going to seed the middle part of the bone marrow. What that's not going to be seeded with is going to be cartilage cells. The cartilage cells, they're going to grow, and as they grow, the lacunae get really big. Think of like soap bubbles that are small, and then they start to get really big. Well, when they do that, the space between them becomes very thin. What now happens is that mineralization occurs in between it, which makes that little barrier between them very fragile. What now happens is those small little bubbles will break, and as they break, they make single bubbles. And then they make more bubbles. And that's how you start to make the marrow cavity in the middle of the shaft. What will now happen is that will propagate from the middle of the diaphysis all the way up toward the top part and the bottom part of it, stopping at that epiphyseal plate. That's the growth plate of hyaline cartilage to get longer. Shortly thereafter, in the tips, in the epiphyses, the same thing will occur, but at a much decreased pace. So you're going to have 3 marrow cavities, the big ones in the shaft and 2 small ones in the epiphyses. Long story short, that's then how you do it through intramembranous. Okay, and then let's see. Moving on, then I then have in your notes growth, which would be elongation. Of course, my stuff's out of order now. Elongation and elongation, and then appositional growth. Elongation will be how a bone grows longer. Understand this is terminal, meaning that it's only going to occur as long as there's a hyaline plate, the growth plate actually still functional, and the chondroblast can actually, the cells can actually divide. That slows up and eventually gets absorbed for most people, for females by their late teens, early 20s, by males by their mid 20s, meaning you can't grow any taller, you can't grow any longer. So elongation is a terminal form of growth. What's going to happen is, if you saw in your notes, I have this little diagram in your notes, but I already filled in, and I have different layers, meaning that's going to be the layers from the epiphyseal plate, either going to the shaft or to the tip, the stages of how it's actually going to become bone. I'm not going to go through it all because, quite frankly, if you're going to be an osteopath, you'll need it. If not, this is just to get us through AP. Okay, so in short, it has to be a methodical progression of hyaline cartilage slowly converting into bone. Very, 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 very similar to the similar to endochondral ossification. Same process. We have the bubbles form, they solidify, and then they calcify, and then become solid bone. Very similar to it. Now, with that, at the bottom, a couple key points around here is that bone elongation is very similar to the process of endochondral ossification that I just went over. So what you got to understand big time is, in order for a bone to become longer, it's not the result of bone cell division, it's the result of cartilage cell division. As the cartilage cells divide, then they become bone. Eventually, once you stop growing taller, that whole hyaline cartilage plate, the epiphyseal plate, will become absorbed and will become completely ossified, hard. What will now result is a really thin crack between the epiphyses and the diaphyses. It's a type of joint. Basically, it's an immovable joint. But that's called the epiphyseal line, meaning once that's formed, it's solidified and you can't grow any taller. Now, on the next page, when you see appositional growth is growth in girth, not length. Girth, different from elongation, occurs your entire life. So your bones constantly remodel the width of the bone itself. If you remember in class, I said on the diaphysis we have that layer called a periosteum. That periosteum, underneath it, has a layer of osteogenic cells on the inside. Inside the marrow cavity, in the endosteum, we have a layer of what's called osteoclasts and osteogenic cells. Osteogenic cells are found on the inside and the outside, more or less because if the bone breaks, it's easier to fix. But if you remember, the osteoclasts are bone destroyers. The ones on the outside, the osteogenic cells, are going to be bone formers. What should happen is, as the osteogenic cells on the outside are dividing and they're getting wider and wider toward the outside, making new bone, osteoclasts on the inside are going to be breaking down and shedding the bone on the inside, keeping pace with the bone layering on the outside. Therefore, your bone never becomes thicker, never becomes thinner. It should just stay pretty much the same. An imbalance of that are anomalies that could occur in your bones. Think like at the end of your lecture notes, you'll see Paget's disease. That's one form of this. Osteoporosis is a derivative of this type of problem as well too. When you see then, like I said, you're going to have your two layers being set up. This form of growth, appositional growth, is very, very analogous to what I went over, not endochondral ossification, but intramembranous ossification, where you lay down the spongy, it becomes hard, lay down spongy, it becomes hard, that type of thing, like the diploe version of it. Now, keep in mind then that with that, this form goes your entire existence. Okay? Now, how does your body remodel bone? You see the next point in your outline is going to be called Wolff's Law of Bone. Wolff's Law of Bone simply says this: bones that are utilized more often or put more stress on them more frequently will become thicker than those that they do not. It's the whole principle, if you don't use it, you'll lose it type of idea. Now, first off, therefore, if, as you see in there, big stars, if a bone is not used a lot, that means you don't need the minerals there. They can be used somewhere else in your body. What should happen? The bone should become thinner because you're not using it. Well, how does it become thinner? Osteoclasts will strip it down, disperse the minerals somewhere else. Okay. If the bone is used more often or more stress placed on it, what's going to be the difference? Osteoblasts now have a higher activity, and they deposit more bone tissue to make the bone thicker over time. Why? To prevent a break, because you're putting more stress on it or using it more often. Therefore, you're using it, you want to make it more substantial. All right, moving on down then, you see there is what's called mineral deposition. Basically, you can read that as well as I can. It's not a big deal. Basically saying that your bone cells are one of the few cells in your body which promote mineralization. They give off inhibitors of other inhibitors from tissues absorbing minerals, meaning like this: your lungs, your gallbladder, your liver do not want to ossify. They don't want to get hard, because if they get hard, they're non-functional and you're going to die. So what happens, those tissues that are soft give off inhibitors that prevent mineralization. Your bones will give off inhibitors of their inhibitors, saying basically if they don't want it, I'll take it. And therefore they absorb it, and that's how your bones become hard. But you can only draw this out of your blood if your blood hits a certain concentration of minerals first. In other words, a supersaturated solution of calcium and phosphate, which is why you need those in your diet. All right, so for reabsorption, next point down. Remember that the bone destroyers are osteoclasts, and as I went over in class, these are larger cells with a ruffled border on one side. What they will do is they will give off hydronium, chloride, and acid phosphatases into the surrounding area. Well, the hydronium and the chloride together make hydrochloric acid. Those dissolve the hydroxyapatite and the calcium carbonate. They dissolve the minerals. Well, the acid phosphatases destroy the collagen, because you got to destroy what's holding it together as well too. The border is ruffled because it gives a bigger surface area, so now when you then take the calcium and the phosphorus and you've now made it into ion form, like a big sponge, you can just suck it into the osteoclast, and the osteoclast can take it somewhere else to be used, to somewhere more useful for the body. As far as calcium and phosphate homeostasis, those numbers you see right there in your outlines, those are more for FYI. If you need testing later on, for med school or whatever, those are parameters just so you know what are, quote, the acceptable levels. All right, so if we then go to the next page, which then goes over imbalances. Okay, so imbalances now would be, I don't even know why I keep looking. All right, imbalances would be hypocalcemia, hypercalcemia. Hypocalcemia means there's too little calcium within the blood. What now happens? This is a problem. Why? Calcium, whenever it's in low levels, will bond to sodium channels found in your excitable cells. Those sodium channels open up gates which allow ions to pass through, meaning electrical impulse. So basically, any tissues that would use electrical impulses, they're going to get altered. So when the calcium binds to it, these sodium channels can open up more easily and open up for longer. So now what happens? Sodium flows in at a much more fast-paced rate, on a regular rate, making that excitable tissue more active. Symptoms of hypocalcemia. Symptoms of hypocalcemia could be anything from, usually you get like agitation. Basically think like your nervous system is lit up like it's like a fork in an electric socket. That's how it feels. Basically you're highly energized. Meaning the nervous system is overstimulated. When the nervous system is overstimulated, that means your muscles are overstimulated. So what's supposed to happen when a muscle contracts, it's supposed to get an impulse, contract, and then relax. The problem with this now is when the sodium channel is opening, it's telling the muscle, contract, 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 contract. So before it gets a chance to relax, it has to contract again. What you feel is one prolonged contraction. That's called tetany. Think like tetanus, lockjaw, tetanus. Doesn't mean the muscle has locked up. It's just hyperactive and it can't relax. That's why it locks up. Hopefully, this is temporary, okay? Now, what could be causes of this? Many things. As you see, there's a couple of things listed there, like 5 things. Number 1, you can have a parasite growing inside you, meaning you're pregnant, because that thing is sucking all your will to live and calcium out of you, so therefore, that's one way to have lower calcium. Another one, hopefully not related to pregnancy, would be chronic diarrhea, because that would then also push it all out too. Number 3 would be a vitamin D deficiency, because vitamin D is necessary to take the calcium from the blood to facilitate it to make it into bone. With low levels of vitamin D, you can't as well make the bone mineralized. If you have a thyroid tumor or you have partial or full removal of the parathyroid gland, those two glands are necessary for a proper balance of calcium in your bloodstream, which is the next subject up, which is going to, then hypercalcemia, the opposite side of this. Hypercalcemia means too much calcium in the bloodstream. So now what happens? The exact opposite to the sodium channels. Too much calcium binds, sodium channels don't open as well, and they're sluggish, which means now the tissues that were hyperactive now become very sluggish. In this case now, you would see behavioral problems with that person, things like depression, schizophrenia, paranoia, those types of things will happen. Along with that too, you always feel tired. Along with that then, where it becomes fatal is whenever the most important muscle in your body becomes sluggish and you go into cardiac arrest. All those can deal with hypercalcemia. Now, hormone controls. You see 3 hormones there: calcitriol, calcitonin, and then parathyroid hormone. In your outline, big, really important, link calcitriol to PTH. They are linked together. Why? Because without PTH being present, you cannot make calcitriol. PTH is the one that's going to facilitate the last step in the synthesis of calcitriol. So no PTH, no calcitriol. You need those two together. Now, calcitriol and parathyroid act in the exact same way, meaning that they're going to be synergistic. What happens is that your bloodstream levels have become too low to calcium. So what do? You got to bring up your calcium levels. So both of these will act to bring up calcium levels due to low calcium concentrations. How it does that, I've given you the way that it works, listed 1 through 3, 1 through 4. Okay. In short, what we got to do is the most important. You can reabsorb from the kidney. You can reabsorb from the intestines, because that basically you'd be wasting calcium through the urine or through feces. Other thing, the most important one, you see there, big stars, you stimulate the osteoclasts. You turn them on to break down bone tissue, to then absorb calcium, and then put it in the bloodstream to bring you back to homeostasis. That's the major one. Now, calcitonin does the opposite of the other two. It's given in response to high calcium blood levels. So what do? You got to get that calcium the hell out of your blood and put it back in your bones. How's that going to work? You got to stimulate osteoblasts to do their job. So like sponges, they'll suck in the calcium and the phosphate, calcium, and then mineralize it to bring you back into homeostasis. All right. Now, last but not least, for the physiology is fractures. You see there that fractures can be described a couple different ways. One could be the source of the break. The second one could be the actual, how it looks in the bone, or how it actually broke the bone. So, stress fracture means that basically you were dumb, you decided to jump off your garage, and you put too much stress on your bone. You didn't imagine that happened. You put too much physical stress because you're a dumbass. Get that, and fine. That's a stress fracture. However, a pathological fracture means a break in a bone that's already been pre-weakened by some existing condition. An older woman has osteoporosis. She slips in the shower and breaks her hip. She broke the hip because the bone was pre-weakened by osteoporosis. That would be considered a pathologic fracture. Okay. Now, as far as the next one, you can go by the fracture line. You can have a closed fracture, which means none of the bones are protruding out of the skin, often called a simple fracture. You can have an open fracture, which means you did a much better job, and now the bone's sticking out of the skin. It's also called a compound fracture because you've compounded your problems. You basically introduce the outside world to your inside world, and that's not good. A complete fracture means you did a good job. You broke the bone into 2 or more pieces. Incomplete fracture means you broke the bone, but it didn't fracture into smaller pieces. It's a partial fracture. Next, green stick is a nasty one. Imagine you put a branch off of a tree and you want to make a fire, but the branch hasn't had time to dry out yet. So what do? You take the branch, put it on your knee, and you go to break it. Well, if it were already dried out, it would snap, no problem. This is not how this fracture works. When you go to bend the stick, the part where you put the pressure bends, but the side opposite will actually fray, like a green stick. That's what would happen to your bone. Meaning it's going to take a long time to clean all that up and knit it back together again to make it back into a solid bone again. Hairline fracture, I'm sure you already know, means a very thin crack through a bone. Usually whenever you have a hairline, the osteopath will go, we'll keep an eye on it, because usually it's already in anatomical position, and it should heal, correctly at that point. Displaced fracture means that the bone pieces are out of anatomical alignment. A non-displaced fracture means they're broken, but they're still in anatomical alignment, meaning that a hairline fracture is an example of a non-displaced fracture. An impacted fracture is bad. That's where one bone breaks and the bone pieces get shoved into the marrow cavity of another bone, like a harpoon or like a javelin. That's not that one again. You see a lot, like in a war-torn type of area. Let's say you're in an army company. The person next to you steps on a landmine. Well, yes, that blows apart the leg. However, that shrapnel from the leg now can go into other people's legs, and that's now where you're introducing something brand new. It's just a really bad scenario. Impacted fracture. The impacted fracture you can also get. Think about if you're driving your car and somebody T-bones you and basically breaks your hip, and those pieces can go elsewhere. That can happen that way too. Linear fracture means that if I have a long bone, my fracture lines run parallel to the shaft of the long bone. Think shin splints. Those are parallel. Those are linear fractures. Transverse fracture means now I'm not going parallel. I'm cutting across perpendicular, meaning that it's an actual, breakthrough. Oblique means any angle other than 90 degrees from that fracture line. Epiphyseal is bad. Epiphyseal is where you take the tip of the bone and you rip it off the shaft. Now, if you were a person who was still growing, like adolescent type thing, that would mean the growth plate that came apart, that ain't going to work anymore. That bone is not going to grow any longer anymore. An avulsion isn't technically a fracture. It's a full removal of body parts from the body. So technically it's a fracture, because to get it off, you kind of have to, break it to get it off. One thing you don't want to hear about if you're working as a paramedic or as an ER, maybe you do, somebody will say, prep because we have a partial cephalic avulsion. Cephalic is a head, meaning the head is almost cut off, and the only thing holding on is essentially the spinal cord. When you see them and they're still conscious, you're like, crap, how can you still be alive? But then you go, oh, damn, because basically their head is like a rag doll at that point. It's barely being held on, but they're still alive. Now, as far as fracture repair, huge, big stars. Know the steps, know them in order, know what's going on. I'm not going to go into it because you can read it just as well as I can, okay? You break it, you make it hematoma, soft callus, hard callus, and then you're going to then put it back into bone again. Similar to the way that we did a deep tissue tear, like for when we were in tegumentary, a deep cut, more or less the same steps but in bone form. Little more involved, but please make sure you read that over. Last but not least, I think at the end of it was then a list of bone anomalies or bone diseases that you're liable for. The ones that I highlighted, you're 100% liable for. The ones that aren't, more FYI. Okay? When I do my next clip, I'm going to go over the bone joints, the articulations, but again, it's all spelled out. I'm just going to hit the finer points. All right, thank you.